So thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. So I am here with Dr. Bruce Haynes, and I'd really love to know a little bit more about how you got into the philosophy of education, Bruce. What drew you into philosophy initially?
Well, there are two kinds of answers there. One is I started teaching in 1963, and I was asked by one of the boys in the class after about 6 months, "What are you doing that's still here?" And I think that was a reasonable question because I didn't have an answer. And it occurred to me that I should really be able to provide a rational answer to myself and perhaps to others as to what it was I thought I was doing and why I was doing it. And that tended to boil down eventually to questions of epistemology and of ethics. There was also a side part to that. My then fiancée, Felicity, had done a unit in philosophy. I hadn't been allowed to do that because the Teachers' College banned philosophy as a subject for undergraduate students. And so only when doing a Diphead did I first come across philosophy at all. Mm. And basically what got me hooked was a first assignment, which was the Wittgensteinian thing, I have a pain, you have a pain, discuss. And I've been in pain ever since.
So it's really interesting. Can I ask what year this was when the philosophy was banned?
So 63 was when that was, yeah.
63, right, okay. So it wasn't until you did your Diphead that you started to get involved in it.
Yeah, and so it was basically as postgraduate, yes.
Yeah. So was there something about it that particularly drew you in, apart from the pain?
Well, I was puzzled about what we were teaching students and why we were teaching that, and of course, how we were teaching it. And so those seem to be a combination of epistemological questions, trying to work out what counts as knowledge and the reliability of it, why one selects some rather than others, and of course the ethics of it in terms of the ethics of teaching some things to particular students, given a central mandate which was universal. Why was it that it was appropriate to teach it to these particular students? So it really was that I had what constituted an inoculation of psychology. And I knew that rat chasing was an absolute waste of time. And ever since Thorndike beat Dewey almost a century ago, it has been the dominant parasitic problem in education. And philosophy had the potential to be, in some way, an antidote to that.
Yeah, I like that terminology of a parasite, actually. It's yeah, I think that's enduring as well. So we're looking at quite a long span of time. So there'd be 93, probably 60, almost 60 years of your involvement in the philosophy of education. So looking back over that time, are there key themes that you can see that you've been following that you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, I started out in analytic philosophy with Wittgenstein and John Austin making interesting noises about language. And so that gave me some basis for work. But I was never particularly enthused about doing philosophy. So that the idea of whether you take philosophy to be rorty, doing history of ideas, or some supra enlightenment approach which enabled you to be the, in a sense, pontificating sage. What I was trying to do was to be a philosopher of education. And for me, that means that I'm not doing philosophy, I'm doing education. And I'm trying to use philosophy to solve educational problems. So I'm not interested in dissecting the entrails of a particular philosophical position for the sake of doing that. I want to use that activity to try and produce educational outcomes which I can justify.
So it's got this very practical edge to it.
That's what is the driver of it.
And through your work, do you feel that you really found something that did enable this practicality that otherwise might have gone overlooked?
Well, I found that there was a degree of enthusiasm in the 60s and early 70s, where people were coming out of the post-war conservative stuff and not just the hippie revolution and the beatniks and the love everything, all of which passed us by in Perth. We didn't do that at all. But there was a degree of intellectual opening up and freedom, and there was an expectation amongst philosophers of education in general, both in the US, the UK and here, that if we worked at it, we could actually make a difference, educational difference. And in a sense, the battle was against the behaviourists at the time, the Skinnerians and that sort of thing. But politically, the world seemed to be opening up, and if one was able to make certain distinctions and produce good arguments, you might well be in a position to improve the way in which teachers were able to operate. What's changed is that the political landscape has turned conservative. The psychology stuff has become even worse. Psychometric stuff is now even more dominant than it was then. And what has occurred in the schools as a result is a travesty of education. So in that sense, we've gone from a period of optimism to one where you're trying to salvage something from the apocalyptic wreck.
It feels like a sad turn.
It is a sad turn. And if you look at the universities, when I first was appointed to Teachers College in 1970 to teach philosophy of education, it was expected at teachers' colleges that all students graduating would have done something in philosophy of education. Now almost none do. There are a few backwaters like Newcastle, of course, but most places. Now, the notion of having philosophy of education or anything remotely related to it has long since gone.
So bearing that in mind and this sort of turn towards this conservative politics and how it's infiltrating, the education, and sort of leeching it of the philosophy and it's becoming very skill-based. So what would your hope be to return to that sort of optimistic framework for the future of philosophy and education?
Well, that's my kind of effort. So once I retired, I stopped doing what I'd been doing. And that was battling with notions of knowledge based on truth. And so what I've tried to do is to get rid of truth and exploring the possibility that something which was trust-based instead of truth-based could reconfigure the way we look at the world.
Oh,
and so
this is fascinating. So
just a minor task, but that's the ambition.
So when you say trust-based, trust between whom or what?
Yeah, well, that in a sense is the major thing. So trust, for instance, has not been a philosophical topic of interest for the last couple of millennia. But in the last couple of decades, it has begun to do so. But it's working off a base where traditional philosophers looked on trust as interpersonal moral relations. It's not, it's far more than that. But the complexity of that is being explored. So simply saying, what is trust is your opening question, but then again, no easier than the previous one we tried to get rid of. So the difference in part is that truth being something which is eternal and nothing to do with you as a person or persons is something which, if you deal with that in schools, means that the teacher has it, the students passively accept it. Trust, however, is a relation, and as that requires the student to be active. So it's a fundamental change in the way one sees schooling. So
sounds so interesting. So can I ask your paper that you'll be presenting at PESA, does it touch on this issue or is it on something completely different?
Oh, it's on something completely different. It's called Trust as the Aim of Education.
Oh, excellent. So we will be hearing more about this at the conference. Yeah, it sounds so fascinating.
I published it in EPAT today, but I couldn't get my password, so I couldn't publish it.
Oh, this sounds like a typical philosophic problem as well. Just before we sort of end our chat, I did want to just reference the picture that you sent me. Is that okay? I think that it was very pertinent, given that the theme of this sort of section is looking back. And I'm just going to see if I can just share my screen so that we can get a picture of that picture.
While you're doing that, the picture was taken at after the PESA conference in Auckland in May 1977, and I'd gone up to see Jim Marshall, but I'd got into the Bay of Islands at about 3 o'clock in the morning, which was a bit too early to say hello, so I went fishing instead. That started our fishing competition. What's good about PESA? Remembering that back then, we were living in little isolated cocoons, quite separate and different from the way we live now. So as there was nobody else in my institution doing philosophy of education, there's no one to talk to. Every now and again, a journal would wander past, or maybe a book. PESA provided a community within which one could test out ideas, find out what other people were doing in order, and that was why I was doing it, in order to know what to do with my students in teacher education.
Amazing.
I mean, that was the driver of going to PESA. The friendships, I mean, I had a 30-year fishing competition with Jim, are a critical component of all of that.
Did you win this particular one with this?
Well, you see, as philosophers, we had a problem. I claimed I won. You can see it. Jim claimed that the competition started after lunch. You can see the lunch. And for 30 years, no matter how we did it, neither of us ever again caught a fish. So I claimed I won on the basis of this one. Jim claimed it was a draw because we never caught another fish after.
I think we'll have to open up a poll underneath this interview to see who people agree with, you or Jim. Thank you so much for sharing the picture. It's from the 1977 Auckland conference. Is that's correct, right? Yeah. And let's hope that you know, our current conference is going to be just as fun as that one was. Can I just ask, just before we leave, were you one of the original founding members of PESA?
No,
right.
I was invited to join in 1971 by Bert Priest, who was my supervising professor at Kiwi, who was at the UWA. He had been part of the initial formation in 70, and when he came back, he said, "You should join." So, no, I was not an original founding member at all. It was very much a New Zealand and New South Wales arrangement at that time.
But you joined 1 year later, so let's say you were up there. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Bruce, for sharing your stories with us. We really look forward to hearing your paper at the conference and finding out more about the concept of trust versus truth.
Okay, bye.
Okay, have a good night. Bye-bye.